Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Chemdawg, the cannabis strain that came from 13 seeds in a parking lot at a Grateful Dead concert in Indiana. So, the story goes that a stranger sold a bag of weed to a random grower from Massachusetts. This was back in 1991. That single transaction would go on to create some of the most legendary cannabis strains in American history. Strains like Gorilla Glue No. 4, OG Kush, and of course Sour Diesel. One bag, 13 seeds, some of the most important strains in modern cannabis history. If you're new to this channel, this is where I cover the history of cannabis, including the strains, the people, and the stories that shape this entire culture. Hit subscribe, and let's get into it. The story of Chemdawg starts on Shakedown Street. The Grateful Dead performed thousands of live shows across their 30-year career, and by the early 1980s, there was an entire parking lot culture that traveled with the band from city to city. It was called Shakedown Street. It was named after the band's 1978 album and single. Shakedown Street was an entire economy that's unique to the jam band scene. Deadheads sold food, crafts, clothing, and of course controlled substances. It was all the fun of their travel from show to show. And within this economy, cannabis was the primary commodity. But in cannabis terms, Shakedown Street wasn't just a retail market. It was a traveling genetics exchange. A grower from, say, Northern California could meet another grower from Massachusetts at a parking lot in Middle America. Seeds moved between people who shared a tribe, but might never meet again. These seeds, and of course the cannabis they produced, were slyly exchanged in the crowd of deadheads outside of music venues. So that brings us to July 1991. The Grateful Dead was performing at Deer Creek Music Center in Noblesville, Indiana. And in the parking lot, a grower from Massachusetts, who would later go by the nickname Chemdawg, meets two other guys who also happen to be cannabis growers. One went by Joe Brand, and the other went by Pbud. They sell him an ounce of cannabis for $500. They referred to it as dog bud or chem weed, and it was really good. It was unlike anything circulating in the East Coast cannabis market at that time. It was chemically intense, diesel-like. It was almost aggressive. But here's the part of the story that's really interesting. The seeds that would go on to become Chemdawg didn't come from this transaction. Chemdawg and Joe Brand exchanged phone numbers at the show. And later, Joe shipped him 2 more ounces. One was seedless, but the other, it contained the 13 seeds that are central to this story. Let's talk about Joe Brand and Pbud real quick. Joe Brand was a West Coast connected grower with access to genetics that hadn't made it east yet. And Pbud, he was another grower in their orbit. Their exact backgrounds are sparse in the public record, but they were both part of the underground network moving high-quality genetics through the Dead Show circuit. And this encounter with Chemdawg was the start of a professional relationship. Joe Brand and Chemdawg stayed connected for years. In 2006, they reunited, and Joe was given 4 of those last 6 original seeds from the ounce that came in the mail. Now let's talk about the man who is Chemdawg. His real name is Gregory Kranzanowski. He went by the name Chemdawg in the cannabis community for decades before his real name became more publicly known. He's from the Boston area and was part of the New England underground growing scene before that Deer Creek show in 1991. He was already an experienced grower before he got his hands on those seeds. The quality of his selections, the speed at which he identified the best plants, and the network he had already built all suggest someone who had been doing this for years. Unlike a lot of other breeders, Kranzanowski has not hidden. He's given interviews to Leafly, High Times, and been on cannabis podcasts. He was even active on the early cannabis forums, and he partnered with licensed seed banks to offer his genetics commercially. But for the purposes of this story, his name is Chemdawg. So what did Chemdawg actually do with those seeds? Well, he didn't pop all 13 at once. Instead, he germinated the first 4 seeds. One came up male, and the other 3 were females. Of those 3 females, one went on to become Chemdawg 91. The variation of Chemdawg that would go on to take the cannabis world by storm. Then, 10 years later, Chemdawg popped 3 more seeds. He labeled them C, D, and E. Chemdog D would go on to become another very popular phenotype. And as I mentioned earlier, Chemdawg later gave Joe Brand 4 of the original seeds. Joe grew them out and identified the best one, Chemdawg 4, also known as the Reunion Pheno. It too would go on to become a prized strain. So when people talk about the famous Chemdawg phenotypes, they're talking about plants that emerged across 15 years of careful selection. To really understand why Chemdawg mattered, you have to understand what cannabis smelled like in 1991. High quality East Coast cannabis at the time ran predominantly towards like an herbal, slightly floral aroma. The Thai genetics that had filtered through during the 1970s and 1980s, they had their own intensity, but it was incense-like or fruity rather than chemical. There was also Colombian gold at this time that was earthy and spicy and had a citrus character. The underground growers in New England, and there weren't many of them at this time, they were working with strains that descended from Mexican and Colombian land races. Nothing in the world had that diesel fuel aromatic register like Chemdawg did. It didn't smell like a plant, it smelled like a machine. Their terpene profile was specific. High carafilene gave it that diesel, spicy, woody intensity. Myrcene contributed earthy warmth that in this context read more as fuel rather than tropical fruit. And then there was the limonene that provided the citrus chemical lift. But Chemdawg isn't the only strain that's described this way. There's also sour diesel. In 92 or 93, Chemdawg met a New York City-based grower who went by the nickname Weasel. Not at a dud show this time, at a fish show. They traded clones. The Weasel walked away with 2 cuts. Mass Super Skunk, which was another strain Chemdawg was growing, and of course Chemdog 91 itself. The Weasel brought them back to a grow room in New York City, and he started referring to Chemdog 91 as the Diesel. At some point, Mass Super Skunk released pollen. It drifted toward the diesel plants. The female plants got pollinated by accident. Now, most growers would have thrown those seeds out, but someone grew them out, and what they discovered was something with a fuel citrus skunk intensity unlike anything that anyone had ever encountered before. This new strain would become known as sour diesel. I have a full video on the sour diesel story, so check that out if you want a deeper dive. But it's really the chain of events that matters here. Chemdawg met a couple growers at a Grateful Dead show in Indiana, got a couple ounces in the mail. One of those ounces contained some seeds. He grew them out and selected the best phenotypes. Later on, he traded some clones at a fish show. Those clones ended up in a New York City grow room where an accident produced one of the most defining strains in cannabis history. So let's wrap this up. On August 9th, 1995, Jerry Garcia passed away from a heart attack in California. He was 53 years old. When he died, the Grateful Dead essentially came to an end. They've continued to tour with different members, but they're not the same band. And the scene at their concerts certainly isn't the same. The Shakedown Street economy that moved cannabis genetics across the country lost its organizing spine. Within a few years, the exchange moved online to the early internet forums like Overgrow and IC Mag. The Grateful Dead never sold cannabis. They never endorsed the parking lot economy. They never knew that cannabis culture was being defined at their shows. They were just the original jam band. But the chain runs backwards to a band from Palo Alto that just wanted to play music, and forward to dispensary menus in every legal state in America. The parking lot is gone, but the seeds from it are still everywhere. That's the story of Chemdawg. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more cannabis history content. I release new videos every week or so on the strains, the people, and the stories that shape this whole culture. And if you want to go deeper, check out my book, Cannabis Lore. I cover Chemdawg and a bunch of other stories in a lot more detail. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching.